Time for a new principle, colleague. This one is going to be kind of like the learning is hard principle in that it will initially sound stupidly obvious, but there's some important nuance in here that I've found super helpful in planning lessons, thinking about just the little comments that I make or asides I make. How do I shape my lessons? How do I think about assignments? It's helped me with all those things. So the principle is you remember what you think about. You remember what you think about. Daniel Willingham, in his book, Why Don't Students Like School? He's the first guy that got me thinking about this super clearly. So if you read chapter 3, you're going to notice me following a very similar line of logic, and in the subsequent videos recommending some very similar things to what he's saying. But I'm going to give you that little DSJR spin that you are counting on in the course made by me. So first, why don't our students remember a lot of the things that we do in class? Why don't they remember the stuff that we talked about? Why do they say things when, after a unit test, like, we never talked about that? And you're just like, what do you mean we never talked about that? Why do they, when we repeat something that we've been over ad nauseum, sometimes look at us with shock and awe, like, wow, I've never heard that before. Why does this happen? There are 4 reasons that students cannot remember what they were meant to learn in a previous lesson. I'm going to put a little graphic on here that Willingham uses in his book to show the human learning system. You notice it's pretty similar to Stephen Chew's, but it's got less busyness in it. The first reason students forget is that they weren't paying attention to begin with. Right now, as I make this video, there's a poster right there. There's a bunch of classroom books right here. There's a back there's a little chair where I'll sometimes do my prep hour power naps. There's a computer monitor over there. There's a bunch of things in my environment, but I'm not going to remember those things when I go home because I'm not paying attention to them. They're here, but I won't remember them because I'm not paying attention to them. That's one reason students can forget. They weren't paying attention. Second reason, it's gotten into their long-term memory, but they're unable to retrieve it. There's a breakdown in the arrow going from long-term memory to working memory. And remember, working memory is just what's in our mind right now. What am I thinking about right now? That's your working memory. So there could be a breakdown from getting it from long-term to working memory, short-term memory. Third reason they cannot remember is because it was in long-term memory, but they forgot it. The human mind is very efficient. It doesn't hold everything in long-term memory. Some people have a belief that the mind perfectly records everything in long-term memory. And if only we could remember it, if only we could call it to mind, we'd be able to remember everything. It's not true. They've done studies where they put people in hypnosis to see if that can aid access to long-term memory, because that's what hypnosis is supposed to do. And what they find is that basically hypnosis does not produce a huge difference in being able to recall extraneous details from long-term memory. Basically, we just don't remember everything. We forget things regularly. And the fourth area where students won't remember things is that it was in working memory, they thought about it, but it didn't go into long-term memory. So there's a lot of opportunities to forget things in the learning system, 4 different opportunities that we've just described. So how do we get stuff to stick? How do we get them to remember the things that they learn in class? Well, one thing that can help is if there's a strong emotion attached to the memory. It could be the emotion of fear, the emotion of happiness, the emotion of sadness, the emotion of shame. Emotions increase the vividness of memory and they increase the likelihood of being able to retrieve it long term. The problem with that is that I can't always bring emotions into my class, and for some of those negative emotions, I don't want to bring those into my class. So that's not super helpful. Another thing that can help with remembering things is repetition. Repetition can be super helpful for remembering a thing. Earlier we talked about maintenance rehearsal, and one technique for maintenance rehearsal is basically repetitively drilling yourself on the knowledge that you're trying to remember. The problem is that repetition doesn't result in total recall. For example, here is an image of a bunch of pennies, which is the accurate picture of the penny. And most people can't confidently say what's the accurate picture. By the way, it's A, and we'll come back to that in a minute, the penny thing. Now, something that seems like it would help with remembering is just wanting to remember it. So for example, if we tell students you're going to need to remember this for the test, why doesn't that result in them remembering it? I mean, they presumably would want to remember things that are on the test. They all want to do well on the test. So why doesn't that help? But you and I know from everyday living that just wanting to remember something doesn't always make it the case. If Crystal, my wife, gives me a list of things to grab at the grocery store on my way home from work, I want to remember that, but sometimes I get to the grocery store and alas, I don't remember the whole list. I wanted to remember it, but I didn't remember it. Or think about the last time that you were at a party and you met someone new and you're like, oh, I want to remember this person's name. It's really important to me. 5 minutes into the conversation, you suddenly realize, I don't remember this person's name. You wanted to remember it, but you didn't. So wanting to remember isn't enough. No, the key to remembering things in a way that's useful for class is to think about those things. But we have to think about them in the way that we would like to be able to use them someday. So let's go back to the penny example. You and I have seen pennies thousands of times in our life, but we don't think about the image of the penny very much because that's really not useful information. What's useful about the penny is how much it's worth, which is not a lot. So 100% of us could give the monetary value of the penny. That is available in long-term memory and is easy to retrieve because we use that information a lot. We think about that aspect of the penny a lot. But when it comes to the visual aspect, we don't think about that much. Here's a study that ties a lot of this together. 2 groups, each were given a list of words and they were told you're going to be tested on these words later. Group A was told to, for each word, identify whether or not the word had an A or a Q in it. So that was what Group A was told to think about when they were looking at this list of words. Group B was told to think about if each one of these words is pleasant or unpleasant. Fast forward, they take the test. Who does better on the test? It's Group B. Why? Because Group A, in looking for letters, they don't really have to think about what the words mean. This is the key to this whole principle. We remember what we think about when we think about what something means, That's the key, is to think about what something means. So Group A wasn't thinking about meaning. They were thinking about what the word looks like, what the word contains. But Group B did think about meaning, and so when asked to retrieve this list of words, they were way more successful. They remembered like twice as many words. So what are we going to need to do in this principle? We're going to need to think about how do we, in our lessons, get students thinking about the meaning of the material they're trying to learn. Think about what the heck that material means. That's our core challenge. And so now we begin to examine our practice, the way that we design lessons, structure lessons, the way that we design and present assignments, the tasks that we give our students to complete. And how do these tasks, lesson structures, assignments get students thinking about meaning? The meaning of what they're doing. That's the crux of the challenge of this principle. And the principle is we remember what we think about.